The beginning in the vast land of America. I was born in 1942 in a small windswept town just outside Kansas City. My childhood painted by the vast amber fields of the Midwest and the steady hum of freight trains in the distance. It feels almost surreal now to think of how the possibilities of America stretched endlessly before me back then, like a great plain, open and mysterious, both inviting and intimidating. I grew up the middle child in a family of 5, between an older brother who was everybody's hero, and a little sister with dreams wilder than the prairie storms. My father was a second-generation Polish immigrant who worked tirelessly as a railroad engineer, his hands always calloused, his eyes forever hopeful even during the leanest years. My mother, the daughter of a schoolteacher, possessed a quiet strength and an ironclad belief in the American dream, baking her hope into every homemade pie, pressing it into each crease of our Sunday best. Our home was humble, the furniture worn, but our hearts brimmed with ambition. We were fed on stories of new beginnings, and around our rickety kitchen table, my parents often spoke with longing about all the places in America they'd one day see, all the lives they'd live if just given the chance. Even as a child, I was entranced by the rumblings of change. The 1950s were an era of both innocence and upheaval. The smell of bread baking mingled with the static crackle of radio broadcasts, announcing new victories, terrifying disasters, presidential speeches, and the growing beat of jazz music drifting down the alleyways at dusk. I was always the curious one, peeking into neighbors' gardens to see what grew, hitching rides on my brother's bike into town, watching the main street shops swap out window displays with each new season. School was my world. I'd sit in the front row in Mrs. Turner's class, hand raised so often I had a permanent cramp, breathlessly scribbling down every word about places I had yet to see. New York, San Francisco, the Grand Canyon, the Appalachian Trail. My favorite refuge was the public library, its cool marble steps and the smell of musty pages promising adventure with every book I touched. I used to imagine I'd grow up to be an artist, painting epic scenes of the American West, or maybe a journalist, documenting the birth of a new world right before my eyes. College was never a promise in the dusty corners of our home, but my mother always believed I'd find my own way. So I waited tables at Gus's Diner through high school, socking away every tip, determined to set my sights beyond Kansas. When the day finally came, my one-way bus ticket to New York City, a tremulous crumple in my pocket, I felt equal parts terror and exhilaration. I hugged my mother at the station, inhaling the scent of flour and lavender from her apron, promised her I'd call every Sunday, and then I boarded that eastbound Greyhound with a suitcase too small for all the dreams I carried. A fateful love in the heart of the city. New York in the early 1960s glimmered with possibility and chaos, not unlike the pulse of my own anxious, expectant heart. My first apartment was barely more than a threadbare studio on the border of Brooklyn and Manhattan, with squeaky floorboards and a single window that looked onto the glowing, ever-shifting city below. I was fresh out of college, clutching my sketchbook and dreaming in color, utterly enchanted by the city's raw electricity. Each day felt like a test of courage, catching the subway or ducking rain down narrow alleys, but I loved even the struggle, the wild unpredictability pulsing in every moment. It was in this whirlwind of city life that I first collided with Daniel. I remember exactly how he appeared, standing beside the magazine rack in a Greenwich Village coffee shop, leafing through the New Yorker with cotton candy hair and paint-stained jeans, smiling like he'd been expecting me. The city was always full of strangers, but Daniel wasn't a stranger, not for a second. He greeted me like an old friend. When he found out I was an artist, he invited me to an underground jazz show that weekend, said it would change my life. I said yes, not sure if this was the start of a romance or the next grand adventure the city had in store. Daniel was, in so many ways, everything New York promised. Unpredictable, fiercely creative, a little bit dangerous. He worked as a set designer for a local theater and filled his rented room with canvases, half-finished, wild with color, music seeping into every scene. He taught me to see the stories in everything, people leaning into the subway's sway, hands reaching out for lost umbrellas, the pulse of neon reflected in puddles after warm summer storms. We went to movies 3 nights a week, sometimes at old revival houses on the Upper West Side, sometimes ducking into tiny independent theaters that only showed European films with no subtitles. Each date became an escape, a little world all our own. Every ticket stub tucked into my journal, every late-night hot dog at Rockefeller Plaza a little victory against the city's coldness. I fell for him fast, swept up in the way he listened, and truly heard the spaces between my words. After 3 months, barely a New York minute by most standards, I knew, and so did he. Our marriage was a modest affair, just close friends and a potluck table, held in a borrowed loft full of sunbeams, second-hand chairs, and more hope than money. We moved into a tiny Brooklyn walk-up, 2 battered suitcases and a record player as our only real possessions. But for us, each day started with laughter and jazz on the radio. Each evening, Daniel would come home with a single flower always chosen for me, roses in winter, sunflowers in June. Simple things maybe, but they felt extravagant to a young couple who had nothing but each other and their city dreams. We made poetry of rainy nights, slow dancing in our kitchen, Daniel spinning Tchaikovsky or Coltrane saying, "As long as we have this, let the world bring its storms." There were moments, spilled coffee, overdue rent, too little heat and too much February, that challenged us, but somehow the city with all its rough edges shaped us and held us together. Looking back, those Brooklyn years feel gold-leafed by memory. Fate, I thought, had brought us together right where we belonged. 2 kids lost and found in the dazzling, impossible heart of America. The sweetest days of happiness. Those years with Daniel in Brooklyn were, without a doubt, the golden age of my life. Sun-drenched and music-imbued, brimming with a joy that softened even the most modest of circumstances. We had almost no possessions to our names, but none of that seemed to matter. The world outside our tiny walk-up pulsed with noise and promise, but within our walls every moment was a little celebration of togetherness. Our shared ritual started each morning with Daniel brewing 2 cups of strong black coffee, the aroma weaving through the apartment, a gentle invitation to wake. He'd sit by the window humming quietly, waiting for me to stir, and we'd watch the city come alive beneath us. The bakery truck on the corner, the stoop kids tossing newspapers, the ever-present rumble of the subway. He treated these simple routines as if they were rare and wonderful gifts, and I cherished each one. On Friday nights, without fail, Daniel returned from work with a single rose always wrapped in yesterday's newsprint, placing it in a chipped vase on our kitchen table. Sometimes he'd surprise me with a handful of wildflowers picked from the edge of Prospect Park, covered with dew and city dust. He never let our routines grow stale. There were impromptu living room dance parties with Tchaikovsky or Miles Davis spinning on our battered record player, both of us swirling barefoot across scarred floorboards as rain ticked against the fire escape. When Daniel laughed, and he laughed often, the sound seemed to chase all the shadows from our apartment. Weekends were for adventure, and for us that simply meant wandering the city hand in hand, exploring street fairs, sampling food from every corner, losing ourselves in vintage bookstores, or catching outdoor jazz in Washington Square. Sundays were reserved for lazy mornings, Daniel flipping pancakes, me sifting through the Sunday comics, sunlight filtering through yellowed curtains. Once a month, with coins squirreled away from my waitressing tips and Daniel's overtime shifts, we splurged on tickets to a Broadway matinee or spent a precious evening at a smoky little jazz club, crammed elbow to elbow with dreamers and artists and old men in weathered hats. Nothing was too grand, but everything felt extravagant in the context of love found after so much longing. We celebrated even our hardships, patching our own pipes, scrimping to pay for heating oil, counting down the days until the next payday, but our laughter and hopefulness made every challenge seem small. Daniel had an old Polaroid camera, and he liked to document our lives in candid snapshots. Me with flour on my cheek, him in a paint-stained t-shirt, the pair of us beaming beside our humble Thanksgiving turkey, so tiny it could fit in a Dutch oven. Years later, whenever I flip through those faded photographs, I can almost taste the steam of our morning coffee and feel Daniel's arm anchoring me to the moment. I knew then in my bones that happiness was not a far-off promise. It was those ordinary, sparkling days, stitched by simple love and the unwavering belief that, together, we could withstand any storm life might send our way. The tragedy of losing a husband, and the beginning of challenges. Losing Daniel was like being struck by a terrible bolt out of a clear blue sky, a moment so violent and surreal that for weeks after, I felt as if I were trapped underwater, the world muffled and distorted. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. He never came home from work at the auto plant in Queens. A fault in a machine, a freak accident, and just like that, the man who had filled my life with music, laughter, and endless kindness vanished from the world, leaving me with 2 tiny boys and a grief so vast that I could barely breathe. In those first days, I felt adrift, shocked by the cruelty of fate and the randomness of loss. The apartment, once abuzz with Daniel's humming and our shared dreams, became unrecognizably silent. There were nights I would wake in the dark, reaching out for him in bed, only to find his side chillingly empty. Friends sent casseroles, neighbors offered sympathy, but no one could fill the crater left in our little family. It was hardest at the edges of daily life, pouring a third bowl of cereal at breakfast and realizing Daniel would never join us at the table again, or listening to our favorite record and breaking down when I remembered the partner I used to dance with. I tried hard not to let my sorrow swallow me whole for Tom and Mike's sakes. They were so small. Tom tottering around the apartment, Mike barely able to hold a spoon. Their big, searching eyes broke my heart every time they asked in that plaintive little voice when Daddy was coming home. What could I say? I knelt beside them, pulled them against me, and told them Daddy was watching from heaven, just beyond every sunrise and every hidden wish. The weight of raising them alone was crushing. I felt like every responsibility in the world had landed on my shoulders overnight. There was no time for self-pity, bills needed paying, tiny bellies needed feeding, and the rent on our modest Brooklyn apartment didn't stop just because my own sadness wanted it to. So I got to work. I took on extra shifts at the diner where I'd waitressed before, the work now grueling and endless. After closing up late at night, I'd walk home through drizzle or snow, fighting the urge to collapse. In the mornings, I found a factory job on the outskirts of the city, packing boxes until my arms ached, then rushed back to pick up the boys from the neighbors and begin the nightly marathon of dinner, bath, and bedtime stories. Weekends, if I had even an ounce of energy left, I baked cookies to sell at the church bake sale or swept out the stairwells of our building for a few extra dollars. Every single dollar counted, every penny pinched, a daily tightrope act between hope and exhaustion. But oh, Daniel, I never stopped missing him or feeling like life had cleaved in two before and after. Sometimes late at night I would look through our old photographs, Daniel grinning with flour on his nose in our kitchen, the two of us tangled together in laughter on an autumn picnic. I kept one small photo by my bed, whispering every secret and struggled to it before I drifted off, as if on the other side of sleep, Daniel might just answer. I clung to those memories, letting them light my way forward in the terrifying dark. Somehow, though the grief never truly faded, I learned to keep moving, carrying both my heartbreak and hope for the future, step by trembling step. A solo parenting journey abroad. It's strange how, when the world shatters beneath your feet, life finds a way to push you forward regardless of whether you're ready or not. After Daniel's passing, I found myself thrust into a chapter I'd never imagined, raising Tom and Mike, my two young sons, alone in a country that, though I called it home, suddenly felt vast and impersonal. Some mornings exhaustion would press down on me like an unmovable stone. The city outside our smudged Brooklyn window roared constantly, oblivious to the pain curling up on our side of the glass. My days became a balancing act on a tightrope stretched thin between work and motherhood. I'd leave the boys with our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, before dawn, whispering promises that Mommy would be back before bedtime, even though I knew it might be a lie. To make ends meet, I cobbled together any work I could. Double shifts waitressing at Gus's diner, early mornings boxing up inventory in a cold factory on the outskirts of Queens, cleaning apartments of people wealthier and less weary than I'd ever been. My hands grew raw and knuckles cracked. I counted every dollar as though it were a lifeline. At night, my only peace came from watching the steady rise and fall of my sons' sleeping chests, their innocence a fragile shield against the hardships waiting outside our door. There were nights I lay awake in the dark, clutching Daniel's photograph, silently begging him for strength. What haunted me most were the questions with no answers. Sometimes little Tom would toddle up and tug on my skirt, his big eyes searching. "Mommy, is Daddy coming home? Did he forget us?" Mike, still a baby, would stare up from his crib, dark curls sticking to his damp forehead, and all I could do was rock him and hum lullabies I barely remembered. I bit back tears and stitched together lullabies out of hope and desperation, telling them that their daddy was watching over them, somewhere above the rooftops, every time the morning sun split open the gray sky. I became fiercely practical, budgeting down to the last penny, packing school lunches with hand-me-down apples and peanut butter sandwiches. I scrimped on everything for myself, a single winter coat, second-hand shoes, a broken umbrella, just to make sure the boys never felt the chill of want. I attended every parent-teacher conference, cheered at every school play, smiled even when I wanted to hide from the world. I wanted Tom and Mike to know that even without a father, they were never for a moment without love. There was no time or luxury for grief. Any tears I shed were quickly wiped away as I plunged my hands back into sinkfuls of greasy dishes, or wiped little noses running from the cold. But in every struggle, I held on tight to the memory of Daniel, the way he'd insisted our boys grow up honest and kind, the way he'd chosen me above the odds. I carved those lessons into our daily life, telling the boys, we work hard because we believe in a better tomorrow, and we love hard because family is everything. Slowly, quietly, the years passed. Tom excelled in math, Mike in art. The boys grew sturdy and wise, their resilience both a joy and a heartbreak to watch. Sometimes, in the rare quiet moments, late at night with a cup of weak tea or early mornings as I packed lunchboxes, I'd allow myself to marvel at all we'd survived. I wasn't sure when the ache turned into pride, or when Brooklyn started to feel like a place we belonged instead of just a place we lived. But somehow, with every sunrise, I found the courage to hope again. Changing life thanks to a small soup shop. My life took an unexpected turn the year I opened my little soup shop, a decision that began out of sheer necessity and blossomed by some stroke of luck into a new purpose. My sister, always the practical dreamer in the family, saw how hard I struggled and offered to loan me enough for the deposit on a modest storefront out in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It wasn't much, a tiny corner space wedged between a shoe repair shop and a laundromat, its tiled floors chipped and its front window clouded by years of grease and rain. But to me, it was a blank canvas, a place to transform our struggles into something tangible and nourishing. I decided to sell the kind of soup Daniel had loved above all else, rich, slow-cooked beef broth with vegetables just like my mother-in-law used to make back in Kansas. Every batch I ladled onto the stove was infused with memory, longing, and a touch of hope that maybe, just maybe, my boys' lives could change if only I worked hard enough. In those first weeks, the shop was eerily quiet, just the buzz of the overhead lights, my own anxious heart, and the rhythmic chop-chop of onions and carrots. Sometimes customers wandered in by accident looking for cigarettes or a phone booth, leaving with a free sample and a polite maybe next time. But every day I tweaked the recipe and pinned handwritten signs to the lampposts and bus stops, hustling for every hopeful dollar. I chose the name Emily's Crown Soup after a tale I made up for the boys about a girl who turned sorrow into strength. There were low points, days when the cash register barely rattled and nights I scrubbed pots until my skin cracked, wondering if I'd ever crawl out from under the shadow of lost chances. But for every setback, there was a moment of grace. A school teacher who called my soup a taste of home, a postal worker who began bringing his friends, the gentle rise in the shop's chatter as word spread from neighbor to neighbor. My boys, Tom and Mike, manned the counter during weekends, learning how to greet every customer with kindness, how to count change with sticky, eager hands, and how pride could be simmered into something as simple as a bowl of soup. Gradually the lines out the door grew longer, first a trickle, then a steady stream, and eventually swells that filled my humble shop with the clinking of spoons and laughter. Regulars became friends, newcomers became regulars. I started waking up with excitement, plotting new daily specials and perfecting the crusty bread I served alongside each bowl. Every dollar I earned went first to keeping the lights on and the boys in clean shoes, then to patching up our lives, a reliable car, a proper winter coat, braces for Tom's stubborn teeth. After 5 relentless years I'd managed to open a second and then a third location, each one styled with the same battered stools and faded gingham curtains, each one humming with the same spirit of welcome and hard-won joy. I didn't just build a business, I built a legacy from the scraps of heartache, a place where anyone could step in from the cold and find comfort, nourishment, and perhaps a reminder of their own resilience. Emily's Crown Soup had become more than a lifeline for my family. It was a testament to the quiet miracles that grow from hope, grit, and the reckless insistence that tomorrow can still surprise us. When success cannot fill the emptiness within. For many, the outward trappings of success, the deed to a house, a pair of shiny keys to a new car, a college acceptance letter framed on the mantel, are proof that the struggle was worth it. I once believed that too. And in time, Emily's Crown Soup became more than just a way to pay rent. It became the center of a small, bustling world. My sons grew tall and independent, their faces both familiar and suddenly foreign in the soft kitchen light. I watched them graduate, Tom beaming in his blue gown, Mike clutching a rolled-up degree with hands that shook with quiet pride. Later, the shop's income helped me buy a snug little house, then another as an investment. And eventually, I was able to stand at my sons' weddings, watch them take vows with the determination of men who'd grown up watching their mother claw happiness from hardship. Yet none of this, none of the bricks and mortar or carefully balanced checking accounts or even wedding photographs hung in hallway frames, could fill the empty spaces I still carried inside. I remember sitting alone late at night at the kitchen table, surrounded by the hush of old memories and simmering successes, feeling the bittersweet ache that had settled in me ever since Daniel's laughter faded from our home. I was so busy giving my boys everything I thought they needed that I sometimes wondered if I'd missed the heart of it all, the warmth of their hands, the sound of their young voices late at night, the secret ways they tucked their childhood scars away so I wouldn't notice. There was always another task to do, another expansion to manage, tax forms to file, broken appliances to fix, anniversaries to plan, but underneath, I sometimes felt like a ghost pacing through the very life I'd fought to build. I worried about every decision. Did I squeeze my sons too tight out of fear or let them go too soon? Did I bury my own grief instead of sharing it, teaching them silence instead of resilience? I wanted to be their shelter and their springboard all at once, but being both often left me hollow, wondering if I'd truly given them the mother they deserved. At a certain point, my comfort and relative wealth even became a new kind of burden. I watched as my sons, now with families of their own, drifted further. Calls less frequent, holidays marked by brief visits, obligations just as heavy on their shoulders as mine once were. I began to realize that in my relentless quest to build a better future, I'd sometimes overlook the simple joys of the present. Nights grew quiet. The soup shop, still lively, somehow echoed with the laughter and chaos that used to fill my home. I found myself clutching empty bowls long after closing, wishing I could turn back time or somehow redistribute all this abundance to fill the spaces that mattered most. So, with a shaky but hopeful heart, I gathered Tom and Mike one afternoon, just us three, no distractions. I opened up, sharing the deep sadness I carried, and told them how, in trying to protect them, perhaps I'd built walls instead of bridges. I explained my desire to hand the reins of my little soup empire to them, hoping this act might heal old wounds and show them that above all else, love and forgiveness are the only treasures worth keeping. In the hush that followed, I felt for the first time in years that we were all hearing one another, truly listening, trading regrets for compassion, pain for the possibility of a new beginning. Storms, when mother wants to remarry in her twilight years. The time came when I found myself facing a new, completely unexpected storm, the decision to open my heart once again, decades after Daniel's passing. I remember feeling both terrified and hopeful, caught between loyalty to a memory and my own yearning for companionship through the quieter seasons of my life. It was during a charity fundraiser in Boston that I met George, a retired physician with an easy laugh and a habit of listening more than he spoke. What drew me to him wasn't so much his gentle manner or his reputation, but rather the quiet sadness I recognized behind his eyes, the unmistakable mark of someone who'd known heartbreak and survived. With George, the world felt a little less lonely, and conversations over coffee turned into hours spent sharing books, old songs, and stories of days when our children were still little. When I introduced the idea of George to Tom and Mike, my sons, I was startled by the force of their reaction. I'd braced myself for skepticism, maybe a few protective questions, but nothing prepared me for the wave of suspicion and, yes, heartache that arrived at my kitchen table. Their voices trembled with fear that I might be taken advantage of, that I'd fall victim to someone who saw only the comfort and security my years of hard work had provided. They worried that my loneliness made me vulnerable, that even after surviving so much, I might lose everything to this new chapter. Their words weren't cruel, but they were cutting, tinged by memories of their own childhood losses, the hardship we'd all endured, and the invisible scars they carried as adults. The weeks that followed were shaped by arguments and silent dinners, the kind where no amount of laughter could drown out the tension that had rooted itself between us. Tom would call less and less. Mike, though always caring, looked at me with a worry I hadn't seen since he was a child. There were moments late at night when I questioned if I was making a terrible mistake, if perhaps I didn't deserve a second shot at happiness, not when it seemed to cost my boys so much pain. But then, I'd remember Daniel's voice, quiet and steadfast from the years gone by, reminding me that love doesn't run out, that the heart is designed to hold more than one chapter. George, for his part, showed patience that somehow outlasted even my own stubborn hope. He asked nothing of me except honesty and time. When I confessed my fears and my son's suspicions, he listened, nodding as if he truly understood. He never pushed, never pressed for more than I was ready to give. Gradually, he became part of my routines, a partner for morning walks, a companion at the market, a friend to play cards with after dinner when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed to hush its noise for us. Yet, no matter how gentle George was or how careful I tried to be with my sons' hearts, the conflict simmered. Family gatherings became strained. Holidays, which were once crowded with laughter and easy conversation, drooped under the weight of unspoken worries. I found myself navigating each day like a tightrope, balancing the desire to honor my own needs with the ache of not wanting to lose the fragile connection I'd spent so many years building with Tom and Mike. The old insecurities resurfaced all over again. Was it selfish to want a companion? Had I raised my boys only to follow my heart and leave them feeling abandoned in return? The struggle nearly unraveled me, but underneath my fear another ember burned, a quiet, unwavering belief that it was not only possible but necessary to continue living, loving, and hoping, even after the deepest losses. I owed that to myself, and in some strange way even to Daniel. My journey wasn't meant to end with grief. It was meant to honor his memory by embracing every new chapter with courage, even when the path forward was clouded with misunderstanding and pain. Confrontation, evidence, and secondary happiness. In the weeks after revealing my intentions to remarry, the air in our house seemed thick with tension and unspoken words. My sons, Tom and Mike, withdrew into their own spheres, glancing at me with a mixture of bewilderment and something that bordered on betrayal. It was as if they, who once needed my courage to survive, now felt that I threatened the fragile equilibrium we had all strived so hard to restore. Their hesitation cut deeper than any criticism from strangers ever could. I knew I could not walk into this new chapter without their blessing. So instead of hiding or lashing out, I made a difficult choice. I invited George to meet them, not merely as my companion, but as a man with nothing to prove but the possibility of kindness and respect. That Saturday, the four of us sat around my kitchen table, sunlight slanting across the old wooden surface where so many of our struggles had played out. George brought nothing flashy, just a calm sincerity. He had prepared a folder of financial records, his will, and a letter of intent that declared his plans to leave most of his estate to charity and the remainder to his own children from a previous marriage. At first, the conversation was halting and awkward. Tom, ever the pragmatist, grilled George over practical matters, his medical history, his family, his intentions. Mike, more sensitive, hung back, watching for any sign of duplicity or selfishness. Their skepticism was hard, but it was real and grounded in love. George answered every question with honesty, neither defensive nor evasive. I watched him carefully, willing him to be exactly the man I believed him to be, while also understanding my son's fears. There was so much more at stake than my happiness alone. What I chose would ripple through our family forever. It wasn't a single conversation that changed their hearts, it was the weeks and months that followed. George showed up for every birthday, holiday, and hospital visit. He read to my grandchildren, celebrated small victories, and never tried to replace Daniel, always careful to acknowledge the legacy that had shaped the men my sons became. Gradually the ice between them thawed. Sunday dinners became easier, laughter returned, hesitant at first, then as full-throated as it had been in my kitchen years ago. The day of our small wedding approached. Tom and Mike were not standing in my way, but neither did they rush forward with their blessing. I tried not to press. I knew that love, even second love, cannot be forced into any heart. But on the morning of the ceremony, I opened my door to find both sons standing there, each holding a bouquet, one of wildflowers, one of roses. Their words, though simple, nearly undid me. "We just want you to be happy, Mom." It wasn't forgiveness, perhaps, nor complete understanding, but it was acceptance, the first fragile root of family healing. Walking down the aisle that afternoon beside George, surrounded by friends, grandchildren, and my two sons who had finally gently walked me toward a new chapter, I felt as though the weight I'd carried for so long had finally lifted. My second chance at happiness was not simply my own to claim, it was a testament to the ways in which we all can grow, confront our fears, and choose compassion over suspicion. Through courage, transparency, and love, however imperfect, our family found itself pieced back together, a little battered but still whole. Crisis and reunion of the extended family. Throughout all the years of weathering storms and longing for stability, I suppose I began to believe that the hardest parts were finally behind me. Of course, life has a way of sending its own reminders, never straightforward, and never on a schedule. The real test, I would come to realize, was not in surviving tragedy, or even in building a second happiness from scratch, but in learning how fragile the bonds of family can become under the weight of growing pains, misunderstandings, and the relentless passage of years. When George became a steady presence in my life and my sons gradually accepted their new family, I felt our world settling again, until the crisis arrived without warning. It started with Mike's health, a sudden and frightening diagnosis that made the ground tremble beneath us all. Hospitals with their antiseptic brightness became our second home. I slept upright in plastic chairs, counting the rhythmic blips of the heart monitor, holding my breath each time a doctor entered the room. George was always there, quietly supportive, fetching coffee, making subtle notes for the nurse, squeezing my hand in the elevator as if by doing so he could pull me out of despair. In those sterile halls, every sentiment was magnified: gratitude, dread, a primal love for my grown children that never waned, no matter how old they became. But it was not just the illness that threatened our new foundation, it was the unspoken resentments and old fears that bobbed to the surface during moments of crisis. I watched, heart aching, as Tom, now deeply ensconced in his own career and distant city, struggled with guilt and helplessness. He called less often at first, always apologizing for missed visits and promising to do better. Sometimes his absence was a fresh wound, more painful because of the years I'd spent teaching myself not to expect too much. Not from fate, not from anyone. I remember one weekend when Mike's condition reached a turning point. Tom finally appeared at the hospital, his face drawn and voice tight. The brothers exchanged awkward embraces, both unused to needing one another so openly. Old grievances hung between them, questions about who sacrificed more, who bore the greater weight after Daniel was gone, who deserved forgiveness, and who owed what apology. It became painfully clear, even the strongest families can fracture, especially under the pressure of loving so fiercely and missing each other for so long. Emotionally wrung out, I was tempted to simply retreat. George, ever the observer, saw the growing rift. One afternoon while Mike napped and Tom paced by the hospital window, he quietly suggested I take some time away. "Sometimes love grows best with distance," he said. With mixed guilt and relief, I accepted the idea. I packed a small bag and made my way up to a quiet cottage in Vermont, a place surrounded by birch trees, and the kind of silence that lets you hear the private things your heart wants to say. At first, the solitude felt like failure. Had I come all this way, survived so much just to find myself alone again? But I quickly discovered the quiet was not an enemy but a gentle companion. In Vermont's early morning chill, with only the wind and the call of chickadees for company, I allowed myself to remember, to grieve, and most of all, to forgive. Not just my family, but myself. I realized I'd been clutching so tightly to the idea of keeping everyone together, that I sometimes lost sight of the individual hurt we each were carrying. During those days away, something changed back home as well. The distance forced my sons to rely on each other for the first time in years. Tom stayed longer at the hospital, helping with visits and paperwork, and slowly began to talk, first about mundane things, then about childhood memories, and finally about his regrets. Mike, honest as ever, let Tom into his circle of pain. Meanwhile, George acted as the quiet bridge, relaying news and encouraging the brothers to share even the smallest gesture of care. When I finally returned, there was no grand reconciliation or showy apology. There was instead a subtle shift. Tom and Mike greeted me at the door with tired but open faces. We sat and sipped tea late into the evening, sharing stories not just of survival but of our missteps and misunderstandings. That night, our family, battered by storm after storm, found a new kind of unity, not built on perfection or forced harmony, but on honesty, empathy, and the willingness to let each other be flawed. Looking back, and forgiveness. Looking back after the storm, I realized that forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like the light just before dawn. In the hushed hours of early morning, I often found myself reflecting on every heartbreak, each regret, and, surprisingly, how these have shaped the gentle peace I feel today. After years spent fighting through hardship, building from nothing, and picking up the pieces of my family over and over, I came to see that healing wasn't about pretending pain had never happened, but rather about making space for that pain and letting it teach me compassion, most importantly, for myself. The day Tom and Mike sought me out to apologize will forever linger in my mind. There were no grand speeches or rehearsed lines, just the raw, honest words of two men who had strained, stumbled, and yet chosen to come home. Our reunion wasn't defined by tears alone, but by long, thoughtful silences and small gestures of reconciliation. Mike made me tea the way I used to for him when he was small, strong, a little sweet, a silent olive branch. Tom fidgeted with his hands, then cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry for pulling away, for not understanding how hard it was, for all of us." My heart ached with relief. I saw in their faces the reflection of my own struggles, of wanting to protect but not always knowing how, of loving so fiercely that it sometimes led to pain. It struck me then how easy it is for wounds to linger, festering beneath our attempts at normalcy, and how much courage it takes to finally let them breathe and heal. Sitting together around the kitchen table, sunlight pooling across the worn surface, we allowed ourselves the space to speak openly, even clumsily, about our disappointment and our hopes for one another. George sat nearby, quietly supportive, never intruding but always present. His own journey through loss had taught him the value of patience, and, I suspect, helped guide our fragile family toward reconciliation. Forgiveness, I learned, was never as simple as saying, "I forgive you." It was the daily act of choosing to see the best in each other, of peeling back the layers of misunderstanding, judgment, and fear to uncover the raw humanity beneath. For me, that meant acknowledging my mistakes too, admitting when my own grief had made me distant, or when I'd buried my hurt so deeply that I couldn't hear Tom and Mike reaching for me. It required us to see each other not as the people we wished we were, but as the flawed, brave souls we had become through our shared history. Little by little we forged a new dynamic, not the family of old, nor one built solely on nostalgia, but something sturdier and more honest. We began to celebrate our vulnerabilities, Tom's cautious optimism, Mike's creative impulses, my persistent hope, and George's gentle wisdom. There were moments of uncertainty, but also an abiding sense of relief, like dropping a heavy bag after carrying it too long. Holidays, once tense and teetering between awkwardness and affection, grew warmer. Sunday dinners stretched late, filled with the laughter of grandchildren whose giggles seemed to erase old bitterness. In forgiving each other, we also created room to forgive ourselves. I learned to release the constant, gnawing worry that I had not loved well enough or protected fiercely enough. I started to see that imperfection was never the enemy. In fact, it was the foundation of the love that saw us through. Unconditional, sometimes messy, always real. George reminded us during a quiet evening that family isn't defined by blood or tradition, but by the daily grace of granting new chances, to ourselves and to those we hold dear. As the seasons shifted and I entered the gentle autumn of my years, I noticed a lightness in my step, a contentment that felt well-earned. Forgiveness in the end wasn't just an act but a way of living, a quiet, determined belief that the past cannot be erased, but it can be transformed. I let go of old burdens and embraced the freedom to find joy in each day, in the shared rituals of family life and in the knowledge that we had learned to grow together, not despite our struggles but because of them. Looking back, I see a story not of perfect resilience but of persistence, humility, and deep, enduring love. If I could impart one truth to my children, grandchildren, and anyone who may walk a similar path, it would be this: forgiveness is the root from which all other happiness grows. And as I watch my family gather, faults and all, beneath the roof that once sheltered only sadness, I find peace, knowing that we have chosen, again and again, to come home to one another. Freedom, maturity, and rebirth. Years passed like a gentle tide, reshaping the edges of my life while leaving behind the treasures and driftwood of experience. After so much hardship, loss, and reunion, I found myself, almost to my surprise, embracing a kind of freedom I had never known before. In the beginning I thought freedom meant escape, a ticket out of struggle, an end to loneliness, or the thrill of a second chance. But real freedom, as it slowly unfurled in this later chapter, proved far subtler and infinitely more precious. In my marriage to George there was a softness I never expected, a mutual respect built not on youthful passion or dreams of what might be, but on acceptance of our scars, our limits, and our peculiar daily rituals. We settled into a life that was unhurried, savoring quiet breakfasts in sunlit kitchens, long walks where conversation floated with the clouds, and shared volunteer work that anchored us to our community. No grand gestures were necessary. Our love was a warm, steady current, proof that happiness could be gently rekindled, not in spite of our years but because of them. With Tom and Mike's families blooming, I watched my sons wrestle tenderly with fatherhood, careers, and the same anxieties that once kept me awake at night. Now, instead of carrying their burdens or anxieties for them, I quietly honored their independence, offering advice only when asked, listening more than speaking, and never failing to remind them how proud I was. My daughter-in-law Sarah came to visit weekly, her laughter spilling through the house like new music. My granddaughter, my own little Emily, brought a brightness and a sense of continuity that made me believe in the power of beginnings all over again. Teaching her how to bake, how to tie her shoes, how to spot the robins that landed in our yard. These tasks filled my days with a simple and profound joy. I learned that renewal is as much about letting go as it is about starting anew. I let go of the old need for perfection, the obsession with never failing those I loved, the weight of old regrets that I carried for far too long. I allowed myself to savor solitude when it came, to welcome silence at dusk, and to trust that even if the future remained unknown, I was enough, and always had been. George and I traveled a little, sometimes to the coast, sometimes nowhere farther than the next county for a Saturday farmer's market. Other times, comfort came simply from sitting together at home, paging through family photo albums or swapping old stories over steaming mugs of tea. Giving back became another path to fulfillment. We volunteered at local food banks, tutored children in reading, and organized small charity events at my soup shop. Each effort, no matter how modest, felt like a stitch in the larger quilt of doing good, a way to tie my life's ups and downs into something coherent and beautiful. There was a clarity and peace in this season that I'd never expected. The bruises and blemishes of my past did not magically fade, but with time I understood that healing didn't require erasure. My experiences, painful and joyful alike, became the roots of my resilience, the architecture of my compassion, and the secret wellspring of energy I now shared with my expanding family. Sometimes I'd sit quietly beneath the old maple tree in my yard, marveling at how fully life had come around, not in perfect circles, but in gentle, purposeful spirals. The freedom I discovered was the liberty to change, to learn, to stumble, to begin again as many times as necessary. If I once felt bounded by roles, mother, widow, survivor, businesswoman, now I simply felt human, fully and unapologetically myself. I spent more afternoons with Emily, telling her stories of Kansas winds, New York dreams, and all the small, fierce miracles that had propelled me forward. In her eyes, I saw possibilities flicker ignited anew, and it filled me with the hope that each generation would claim its own version of renewal without shame or fear. So as I look back, my heart brimming instead of breaking, I finally understand. True growth is not about outrunning aging or heartbreak, but about embracing the world's generous habit of giving us fresh chances. Renewal is both a gift and a birthright, and my deepest freedom has been, at long last, to live and love boldly, not in spite of all that's come before but because of it.